Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Idolatry Destroys, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Jeremiah, where we're going to be looking at God's greatness over the idols, and we're going to be discussing how this passage can be abused by other professing believers. So we're going to look at Jeremiah chapter 10 tonight, verse 1 and 2 to kick this off. It says, "Hear the word which the Lord speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says the Lord, do not learn the way of the Gentiles. Do not be dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the Gentiles are dismayed at them." And so the Gentiles worshipped celestial bodies such as the sun, the moon, the stars, so on. And the last chapter, we ended off with God pointing out his people were like uncircumcised nations and their lack of knowing him and their wicked conduct. And here's a plea taking place for God's people to separate themselves from the foolish customs of the nations of the Gentiles. In verse 3 says, "For the customs of the peoples are futile, for one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen with an axe." So vanity is a word used by Jeremiah for idols conveying their emptiness, and they are powerless to inflict harm as scarecrows. And he describes the pagan practice of cutting a tree, setting it in a special place, decorating it, and worshiping it. In Jeremiah, he's mocking the idolatry of Judah like Isaiah did back in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 18 through 20, and Isaiah 44, verse 9 through 20. And every time I read this chapter, it always reminds me of Facebook posts. I'm surprised I haven't seen any yet, because I've seen them as early as Labor Day before, about Christmas trees and how wicked they are, and that this text is for us, and it rebukes us from having Christmas trees. But let's read verse 4 and 5. It says, "They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers, so that it will not topple. They are upright like a palm tree, and they cannot speak. They must be carried because they cannot go by themselves. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, nor can they do any good." So we see that these idols here are carved from wood and ornamented with gold and silver. It's not talking about jingle bells or bulbs or any of that type of stuff. Some were molded from clay, as seen in Judges 18:17 and Isaiah 42, verse 17. And the context points out the impossibility of such non-existent gods punishing or rewarding humans. And what Jeremiah really is saying is that they're powerless to do anything good or evil. And in verse 5, when you read the New King James here, it says that they are upright like a palm tree. When you look at other translations of the Bible, such as the NASB and the ESV, scarecrow and a cucumber field is used. So the key point that Jeremiah is getting across is that they are worthless. And like I mentioned, many will debate this area of Jeremiah, whether we are allowed to have Christmas trees or not. And we're going to see that with memes and everything the next few weeks coming ahead as we're moving closer to the holiday season. And some people will be like, this is why we also cannot celebrate anything Christmas tradition-wise. Note, though, in the text here that Jeremiah is speaking about carving trees to worship. He's not talking about festively decorating trees. And we don't use nails and hammers to put our trees up. So just another small point to make right there. And if you pray to or you worship your Christmas tree as something higher than just a decoration, then you need to get rid of it. And honestly, that's the only thing I can get out of it, is that if you view your Christmas tree as some kind of high type thing rather than just a decoration, then you have a problem. And I'm not going to debate this one any further here. And in verse 6 it says, inasmuch as there is none like you, O Lord. You are great, and your name is great in might. So the God of Israel is different than the idols that are worshipped by men. In verse 7 and 8, who would not fear you, O King of the nations? For this is your rightful due. For among all the wise men of the nations and all their kingdoms, there is none like you. But they are altogether dull-hearted and foolish. A wooden idol is as worthless doctrine. So the God of Israel, the God who has sovereignly created and controls all things, is alone the eternal living God, worthy of trust. And by contrast, earthly idols have to be fashioned by men, and they will perish. And the Lord is great and mighty. And biblical fear is not about having the dread of God's judgment alone, but it includes all reverence and adoration in response to God's majesty and holiness, as you look at Psalm chapter 2, verse 10 and 11. Psalm 2, verse 11 and 12, rather. And I love in verse 8, the blunt speech here, where it says, but they altogether dull-hearted and foolish. A wooden idol is as worthless doctrine. So he basically says, this is so stupid what you guys are doing. In verse 9 and 10, silver is beaten into plates. It is brought from Tarshish, and gold from Uphaz, the work of the craftsman and the hands of the metalsmith. Blue and purple are their clothing. They are all the work of skillful men. But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and the everlasting King. At his wrath the earth will tremble, and the nations will not be able to endure his indignation. So Tarshish was a commercial port in southern Spain, or on the island of Sardinia. And Uphaz is an unknown location. In verse 10, the gods of the nations are nothing, but the God of Israel is the God who exists, intervenes, and brings judgment. In verse 11 through 13, thus you shall say to them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth shall perish from the earth and from under the heavens. He has made the earth by his power. He has established the world by his wisdom. And he has stretched out the hands at his discretion. When he utters his voice, there is a multitude of waters in the heavens, and he causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain. He brings the wind out of his treasuries. So verse 11, something to take note of, is verse 11 is out of the Aramean text, the international language of the period. And it reflects the testimony to be delivered to the nations in a way that they could understand. And the Lord pronounced the doom of the pagan gods. And this is the only verse that you'll find in the book of Jeremiah, verse 11 of Jeremiah 10 of the Aramaic language. And in verse 12, unlike the pagan gods, Yahweh is living and active in his creation. And in verse 13, the Lord controls of the rain, directly counterclaims made for the Canaanite god. And God alone has power over the weather. God alone has power over the rain, the clouds, lightning, and wind. In verse 14-15, everyone is dull-hearted without knowledge. Every metalsmith is put to shame by an image. For his molded image is falsehood, and there is no breath in them. They are futile, a work of errors. In the time of their punishment, they shall perish. So Jeremiah spoke to the foolish conduct of those who make and worship these idols. In verse 16, the portion of Jacob is not like them, for he is the maker of all things, and Israel is the tribe of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name. So God is the all-sufficient source for his people, as seen in Numbers chapter 18, verse 20, and he won't fail them as idols do. And to the nation, God gave his inheritance and covenant love. In verse 17, 18, gather up your wares from the land, O inhabitants of the fortress. For thus says the Lord, behold, I will throw out at this time the inhabitants of the land and will distress them, that they may find out so. So Jeremiah prophetically envisioned the invading army of the Babylonians coming as an instrument of the Lord in judgment. And he warned the people of the land to quickly prepare, but they would be cast out of the land. It was going to be too late for them. In verse 19 and 20, woe is me for my hurt. My wound is severe, but I say, truly, this is an infirmity, and I must bear it. My tent is plundered, and all my cords are broken. My children have gone from me, and they are no more. There is no one to pitch my tent anymore or set up my curtains. So we see Jeremiah emphasizes with his audience, and he uses this medical metaphor often in the book. And the exile is now unstoppable, and Judah's wound is incurable. And we see that Jeremiah, when he prays, he is filled with distress and pain. And in verse 20, Jeremiah shifts into words that Israelites speak when the invaders attack. And they will feel woe due to their wound and cry out over their homes being plundered. They're going to cry out over their children being slain or scattered to exile. And we'll see the picture of desolation of exile more here in just a couple weeks in Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 3 through 5. And it is sorrowful to have to watch your children die. And I know from my own account. And Jeremiah captures the dismay, the shock, the loneliness of those who would endure the severe season of judgment. In verse 21-22 says, for the shepherds have become dull-hearted and have not sought the Lord. Therefore they shall not prosper, and all their flocks shall be scattered. Behold, the noise of the report has come, and the great commotion out of the north country, to make the cities of Judah desolate, a den of jackals. So not only were the idols and the idolaters stupid, but the leaders were as well, as they did not seek the Lord. And no one would benefit as a result. And in verse 22, when we see the word north, think of Babylon. In verse 23, it says, O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his own steps. So man is incapable of guiding his own life adequately. And this prayer shifts to the need of God, who had a plan for Jeremiah before he was even born, as we know from Jeremiah 1:5. And Proverbs 16 verse 9 says that the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his step. In verse 24-25, O Lord, correct me but with justice, not in your anger. Lest you bring me to nothing, pour out your fury on the Gentiles who do not know you, and on the families who do not call on your name. For they have eaten up Jacob, devoured him, and consumed him, and made his dwelling place desolate. So Jeremiah, he saw himself in solidarity with his people, and he understood that the nation must be punished. But at the same time, Jeremiah had empathy, and he desired some mercy and moderation. And Jeremiah prayed that God's full fury would be poured out on the instruments, the nations that would come against the Jews, that induced the Jews into idolatry. And in verse 25, it's a citation from Psalm 79, verse 6 and 7, which you can check out on your own, because we're going to wrap up right here. So tonight, we look at the greatness of Yahweh over the idols, the God of Israel over the idols. And we look at the custom of the decorated tree made an idol. And once again, Christmas trees isn't the focus of the condemnation here. They weren't celebrating Christmas in Judah. And we aren't Judah. And verse 11 through 16 shows us the glory of the Creator God. And when I read this passage, it reminded me of this passage from the New Testament. And I want to look at Colossians chapter 1. Colossians 1, verse 15 through 21, I believe it is. Through 20. So Colossians 1:15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things are created, that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. That is, in all things he may have preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in him all the fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross. So we saw in Jeremiah a foreshadow of Christ as the pre-existent wisdom of God. In Jeremiah 10, 17, 18, we see the warning to hurriedly flee from the invaders. In 19 and 20 is a prayer in the voice of those under the Babylonian invasion. And verse 21, 22 shows us that the trouble comes from the dull-hearted shepherds. And the chapter, it ends with a humble plea for God to recompense to the invading army. And that's going to wrap up our study today. We'll be looking next at the broken covenant and a conspiracy to be announced for the next study. So I hope that you have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you next time.